After we get through the better part of the winter, one of the things we start looking at is doing some pruning around our landscape. There's a couple things to keep in mind when doing pruning. The first thing is we want to make sure that we don't jump the gun on it. We want to let the worst part of the winter get through before we do much in the way of pruning to our evergreens or deciduous shrubs and trees. As you go through and do some pruning on plants, you create little wounds as you do that work, and that just kind of opens the plant up to desiccation, drying out because of the lower humidity, the wind. Even in the wintertime, it warms up, cools down, so that just kind of draws more moisture out of the plant. So that's one of the things we want to think about that could cause additional damage to the plants. If you're thinking about doing pruning very early, you may stimulate growth, and that's why we want to avoid pruning too early in the fall. We want to make sure that we've gotten through that winter and into the last half of the winter, early part of spring. So normally when we do substantial pruning to plants, we're going to look at doing things end of February, first part of March into April before we have bud break. So once we got to that time of year, one of the things that we want to look at, especially with our evergreens, junipers and yews, let's take those two, and maybe even your boxwood, is making sure that we don't get too ambitious in our pruning. These plants many times don't recover very well from heavy pruning, so if you have a smaller plant, it's something that you want to do a little bit every early spring, late winter, and keep the plant the size you want to keep it. You don't want to allow it to get too large too quickly, because you'll open up what's kind of called the dead zone in the middle of the plant, and you don't want to cut into that because you'll expose holes in some areas that don't have live needles or leaves in it. So when we're looking at something like this, we'll come through and we'll prune this back, and I'll try to make my cuts so that I'm hiding those, so I'm not exposing those cuts, and you won't notice those as you walk by the plants. And so we'll look at doing that to kind of get this shape down a little bit and keep these plants the size that we'd like to keep them. With deciduous shrubs, it's the same idea. We've talked about before about caning larger shrubs, so taking a third of the largest canes out. And again, we're going to do that before bud break. And it's important that you know when your shrubs flower, so we want to avoid pruning certain shrubs that flower on very early in the spring. So those are ones that we may wait till after flower to do those shrubs. Shrubs that flower later in the summer, those are ones that we can look at doing a little bit more pruning in the late winter, early spring. So as we look around our yard and we look at some of the plants we have in our yard, common things like the lilac, which there are a selection of lilacs out there. Typically those are going to be some of our early flowering shrubs. We generally will recommend that we wait till after bloom to do some of that work. And so certainly you could wait till we get into the end of May, early June to go in and do some of that caning if you've noticed a reduction in flowering with lilacs. If you've already kind of had that issue with the lilacs, then I would say go in again early before they might bloom and do some of that work. Sometimes it's easier to work around shrubs when they don't have the leaves on, to kind of see exactly what you have and kind of get in there and be able to do some of that work just a little bit more easily. Viburnums are another one. With viburnums there are a variety of them that bloom early in the spring and then later in the summer. So again, it's knowing which one you have, remembering when the flowering was so you can do some of that work. But again, with some of these bigger shrubs, sometimes it is easier to get in there with the leaves off and do some of that work. You're just better able to see what you have and get the shape that you want. You may sacrifice some flowering that first year, but usually you're rewarded the next year with a little bit better show from those plants because you've taken some of that dead out, some of that older wood that isn't blooming as prolific as newer wood would bloom. So to kind of bring it all together, the other things to think about when we're doing that pruning that you could really do any time of the year is the things we've talked about in the past, and that is if you've got dead branches, broken branches, particularly on campus, or if you have a lot of sidewalks around your property, we're always looking for things that may be a hazard to pedestrians. So it's that kind of work that really can be done anytime. It's not extensive pruning. We're not going to damage the plant by doing some of those things, where some of the things I'm talking about may be a little bit more comprehensive on the plant, and that's the stuff that we want to look at doing at the right time of year.